and thank you for this webinar on the role of bilateral dialogues within the one ecumenical movement, experience and results. My name is Vasile Octavian Mihoc, and I'm a WCC Program Executive for Ecumenical Relations and Faith and Order. The World Council of Churches, through the Faith and Order Secretariat, proposes a series of 7 webinars. This one and the second one will take place this year, and the other 5 throughout next year. The proliferation of bilateral dialogue since the 1960s has led to the creation of the Forum on Bilateral Dialogues. The forum provided space for Christian or communions engaged in bilateral dialogues to exchange information, share experience and common concerns, consult together on emerging issues and trends, and reflect on the coherence and integrity of the dialogues. They bear witness to the extraordinary amount of theological agreement that has been achieved, as well as to difficulties and challenges that still remain on the ecumenical journey. This series of 7 webinars is dedicated, on the one hand, to exploring the experience and results of these ecumenical dialogues, and on the other hand, to sharing information and deepening understanding of the ongoing bilateral dialogues. The goals of the webinars are to analyze methodologies and diverse approaches adopted during the dialogues, to study the challenges that have occurred during the dialogues, to examine the correspondence between the bilateral dialogues and the actual reality of the churches involved, to explore the cross-fertilization between bilateral and multilateral dialogues, and finally, to analyze the reception of their achievements and their effectiveness in changing perspectives. Today's webinar will be moderated by Reverend Dr. Miriam Haar from the Institute for Ecumenical Studies and Research in Bensheim, Germany. Miriam Haar is a pastor of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Württemberg, Germany. She has received her PhD in Ecumenical Theology from the Irish School of Ecumenics, Trinity College, Dublin. Before I give the word to the moderator, let me point out that this webinar is also being live streamed on the WCC YouTube channel. So welcome again. I'm now handing over to the moderator. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Dr. Octavian Mihoc, for that introduction. Let me join Octavian in welcoming you to this webinar. I'm delighted to have been invited to moderate today's session, which is focused on the role of bilateral dialogues within the One Ecumenical Movement, experience and results of these dialogues. Today's speakers have extensive experience in both engaging with bilateral dialogues and in analyzing the results. In fact, I'm sure I could take the entire hour to simply introduce them because of their many accomplishments, but as we have only very limited time today, I will simply offer a few brief words by way of introduction immediately prior to each speaker's contribution. Before doing that, I have a few practical announcements. Each speaker will have 10 minutes to offer their presentation. You are all very welcome and actually encouraged to do so, to type your questions using the chat feature in Zoom simultaneously. Those of you who are following us on YouTube, you are also welcome to ask your questions there. Please be brief and concise. And I ask those of you who are not speakers to please keep your microphones muted and your cameras as well. I will invite you at the end of the session to unmute your microphones and your camera so we can greet each other. As we have such a short time for the discussion, we will group questions together to select as many questions as possible. And as a reminder, it is our intention to conclude the session at 2 p.m. Central European Time. So now, our first speaker is Bishop Dr. Brian Farrell. He was ordained a priest in 1969 in Rome and earned a doctorate in theology from the Gregorian University in 1983 with a thesis on sacramental relations between divided Christians. Since 2002, he serves as Secretary of the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity. Bishop Brian Farrell, you're very welcome. I give the word to you.
Thank you, Miriam. Thank you all, and welcome to this webinar. Since I'm going first, I will first of all give some general observations and then some specific points on the bilateral engagement of the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity, which is the executive arm, if you wish, for ecumenical relations at the international level of the Catholic Church. So we all know divisions existed from the beginning, but it's also true to say in a very general way that the idea of church unity has never been missing. And there have always been people who have spoken about it, worked for it. What is new in this era of ecumenical relations is the fact that the churches themselves are now systematically talking to each other about church unity. So bilateral dialogue is not nowadays a question of individuals interested in the point to freely get together and talk. It is an activity of the churches themselves. And I think this is quite an important thing to always keep in mind. The Catholic Church is involved in 15 ongoing bilateral dialogues. And as you well know, the beginning of all this ecumenical activity lies in the Second Vatican Council, 1962 to 1965, in particular in the decree on ecumenism. The Council recalled that division among Christians openly contradicts the will of Christ, scandalizes the world, and damages that most holy cause, the preaching of the gospel to every creature. So with this foundation, the Council formally brought the Catholic Church into the ecumenical movement. It's always important for us to point out that we are working in the one ecumenical movement. It is not as if we Catholics had an ecumenical movement of our own. So this beginning set in motion a whole series of ecumenical dialogues on the international level, but also on the regional and local levels. So we have 5 decades of official international bilateral ecumenical dialogues between the Catholic Church and Christian world communions. Let me point out that ecumenical dialogue starts from the acknowledgement that through our common baptism and our shared faith, we have a real but incomplete communion between the churches. A degree of communion which in our Catholic view varies from one bilateral relationship to another. In this sense, dialogue is directed to making the partial communion existing between Christians grow towards full communion in truth and charity. Dialogue then is meant to unveil the already existing communion and to build it up into a more complete communion. So it's important also to remember that eventual full communion does not mean uniformity. Communion exists alongside all kinds of cultural diversity, different liturgical rites, different forms of piety, different complementary emphasis and perspectives. So the dialogues have produced an impressive number of reports and documents. The reports I would point out to, for those who are listening, on the reports and much other material that went into the dialogues is available on a number of websites, including the World Councils, our Pontifical Council, we have the website, and there are others. So Each dialogue, and there, as I said, there are 15 of them in which we are involved. Each dialogue has its objective, its logic, and its methodology. Each dialogue has its own character and dynamics. It's not possible here in a few minutes to talk about all of that. But let me just point out that each communion has its own method of appointing the members of the bilateral commissions. And this is highly important because it's important that the participants in the dialogues understand that they are there to represent their communion. They should not, therefore, merely present their own personal theologies, their own personal ecclesiologies. They can speak about that, but at the point where the commissions have to try to come to some convergence, it is as representatives of their communion and not as individuals that they should look upon the results. So in the dialogues, which are so very different, the number of people varies. We have dialogues that have 6 or 8 participants from the Catholic side, but we also have the dialogue with the Eastern Orthodox, which has 28 people on each side, because we have 2 representatives of each of the autonomous or autocephalous churches and an equal number of Catholics. So we operate in 2 sections. In our work, we have an Eastern section and a Western section. Why? Because the theological causes and consequences of division and the nature and methodology of the processes in the dialogue are different between the Catholic Church and the churches of the East, and between the Catholic Church and the churches of the Reformation tradition in the West. So let me start a few specific things. Our biggest, if you wish, commission is with the Orthodox churches of the Byzantine tradition. And here, the International Joint Commission for Theological Dialogue between the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church started in 1979 and continues until today. Very briefly, because I'm sure Archbishop Job will speak about this too, we have gone through a long period of dialogue in which many agreements have been reached. We have found that in the fundamental questions, we are the same. Where we disagree and where we are still at work is on the question of authority in the church, teaching authority and governance. The most recent documents, which you can discover for yourselves, lead us to find in the first millennium, when we were united, a guideline for how we might come together in the third millennium. We are now studying the second millennium, when the more difficult questions came up because we separated. For 1,000 years, we have been separated. So the dialogue is now examining the second millennium and the problems of authority and governance which have accumulated during that time. With the family of the Oriental Orthodox, we have the churches of the Armenian, Coptic, and Syriac traditions. The dialogue over the years has been a rediscovery of so much that we have in common. And unlike the dialogue with the Eastern Orthodox, the dialogue with the Oriental Orthodox is not, let me put it this way, the dialogue is not burdened by a deep and prevailing sense of rupture, because these churches grew and developed on the margins or outside the original Roman Empire. And very often the rupture came with the Eastern Empire rather than with the Western. In our dialogue, we do not have that sense of dramatic separation that we do have because of the 1054 and all the subsequent problems between East and West with the two churches fighting each other for so long. As I say, these are very, very quick ideas. I know I'm running out of time. With the churches in the Reformation tradition, of course, we have with the Lutheran World Federation, with the World Communion of Reformed Churches, with so many others. I think we have more than 10 bilateral dialogues. The fundamental question here is, what does it mean to be church? And what are the consequences of the idea that we have of church? And this is basically where most of the dialogues are converging on the idea of church. The Catholic sacramental notion of the church and the more Protestant notion of the church as event of grace we'll have to find, and I think it will be a long path of discovery and recognition, we'll have to find a way to reach a new convergence, which we have not had in the 5 centuries of our separation. So we need, therefore, to recognize that we have different models of Christian unity, and that sometimes these models have much in common, but are irreconcilable in many other elements of our ecclesiologies. And therefore, we have a huge task to complete still in our bilateral dialogues. Very, very briefly, I would also mention the fact that the Catholic Church, our Pontifical Council, has had a dialogue with the new forms of church, Pentecostal, especially the classical form of Pentecostalism. For 40 years, we have been in dialogue. We have also, in recent times, have had conversations with the neo-charismatic churches, and of course with the Evangelical World Alliance. It goes back a number of decades. With all of these new churches, we have been on a path of discovery. We, as traditional, institutional, historical churches, we have to recognize that these new forms of Christian life are in themselves to be taken very seriously, and that they have a challenge to present to our historical churches. This is what we are trying to develop in our relationship in these bilateral dialogues with them, so that we try to understand better what it means that the Spirit is working in these new forms, and therefore challenging us to open our minds and our theology to these workings of the Holy Spirit. With the Pentecostal world, we Catholics have to recognize that since the 1960s, there are millions of Catholics who follow a more Pentecostal form of Christian experience. And the charisms have been an important point of our dialogues in recent times, so that the latest document with the Pentecostal world, not with the Pentecostal World Federation, but with representatives of the Pentecostal world, have been on the nature and the efficacy of the charisms in the Christian life.
Bishop Brian, may I ask you to come to an end?
Yes, okay. The conclusion, therefore, because there's just too much material.
I agree.
The vision is a very profound thing. and it requires a great deal of effort and a great deal of study and a great deal of discussion and dialogue for us to even clarify why we are divided. So we have to continue in these bilateral dialogues. And nowadays, I think that the ecological crisis, poverty and margination in the world, the whole effort to develop a more just society, all of this gives us reasons why the different communions should put the growth into a closer communion in the forefront of their efforts. So this is my hope. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bishop Brian Farrell, for your elaborations on the ecumenical dialogues from the side of the Catholic Church. I appreciate that. I know that the time is very, very short, so I appreciate that all our speakers do their best to keep the time. It was very compelling for me to hear what you shared. So let's move on to our next speaker, who is Reverend Dr. Odair Pedroso Mateus. He serves as WCC Interim Deputy General Secretary and since 2015 as Director of the Faith and Order Commission. A pastor of the Independent Presbyterian Church of Brazil, he is also Professor of Ecumenical Theology at the Ecumenical Institute in Bosse. Reverend Odair Mateus, I pass the word to you.
Thank you very much, moderator. I would like that we now fix a bit our minds on the fact that in this first webinar, we are focusing on the background of the bilaterals and their emergence, especially in the 60s. So I want to invite you to travel a bit back to the 60s, or more precisely at the middle of the 60s, when the Catholic Church embraces the ecumenical movement. I would like, just by way of preface, to do a note about where the WCC, the World Council of Churches, is at this very moment. And I will refer to the WCC Assembly in 1961. So where is the WCC when the Catholic Church embraces bilateral dialogues? Well, the World Council of Churches, and especially its Commission on Faith and Order, is a multilateral space of dialogue, a multilateral space of dialogue in which several communions with different, if not conflicting, ecclesiologies, and therefore with different understandings of unity, are together in dialogue. They aim at visible unity. Which kind of visible unity? In the proclamation of the gospel, in apostolic faith, in sacramental life, in ministry, mission, and service. And this expresses itself in the understanding of faith and order, in the understanding of the WCC at that point. This expresses itself in what we call, in technical ecumenical language, organic union. Organic union. So this is the understanding of unity, and this understanding of unity expresses itself in a model of union that was known, called traditionally organic union. You can visualize that when you think of Protestant United Churches, when you think of the Church of South India, of the United Church in Canada, the Uniting Church in Australia, and so forth. This is where the WCC is, Faith and Order II, at that moment, at the end of Vatican II. Now, I would like to share with you some notes that I prepared for these 10 minutes, and I will try to stay within those 10 minutes. So if we could go to my notes. Thank you, Marcelo. That one is done. We can go to the following. Yes. So, the Catholic Church embraces the modern ecumenical movement by engaging itself both, it's very Catholic to be both, and engaging itself in multilateral and what was then relatively new, bilateral dialogues. There is the joint working group between the Catholic Church and the WCC. By the way, this is where the expression one ecumenical movement, if I'm not mistaken, appears for the first time in a paper perhaps by Professor Nikos Nisiotis. And then the Catholic Church pursues its membership in the multilateral dialogue of the Faith and Order Commission, and at the same time, it launches a series of bilateral conversations that were the topic of the presentation by Bishop Farrell. Next. So, you know, this is, I almost use the word tsunami to describe what happened after that, because the launching of bilateral dialogues by the Catholic Church, with starting with those who had sent observers to Vatican II, reconfigures the landscape of ecumenical theological dialogues. In which way? For instance, what was called then the World Confessional Families, Lutherans, Reformed, Baptists, Methodists, they become full ecumenical actors by adding to their search for confessional unity, the search for Christian unity. So the role of the world confessional bodies in those days changes significantly because they are not only concerned with unity within their confessional traditions, but also with Christian unity in general. Now, the growing number of these of bilateral dialogues, and the number grows very quickly into the 70s, raises issues such as information sharing among them. Are they consistent in which they are saying in one dialogue in relation to which the same CWC or confessional family is saying in another dialogue? Which are the aims of this dialogue in relation to the understanding of unity that I mentioned in the introduction, and which are their aims in relation to models of union? So there is a need for a lot of information sharing and clarification among bilaterals and between bilaterals and the multilateral dialogue that Faith and Order embodied in those days. Next. So one of the early responses to this need was a very interesting project that was launched at the end of the 60s called a Survey of Bilateral Conversations Among World Confessional Families. So I remember the names of Günther Gassmann and Niels Edström, who were in charge of this project. This was a very comprehensive enterprise in which you have they provided, for instance, description of each bilateral dialogue that was taking place in those days. For instance, their meetings, where the meetings are held, the context of the meeting, the background, the ecumenical issues related to those meetings, the history of that dialogue, which were the terms of reference of that dialogue, the composition of the different commissions that were in dialogues, and so forth. And from that descriptive part, the survey goes into other aspects, like which are the methods which are the subjects of those conversations, and so forth. So this was a first attempt, and you see two of the three editions of Confessions in Dialogue in this picture that is not unforgettable, but it shows you the cover of the books. Next. Now, as information is more shared and texts analysis of the bilaterals appear, a debate will take place in the early 70s, opposing or at least involving different views adopted by Faith and Order with its focus on organic union and the Christian communions and their bilateral dialogues. In continuity with its tradition of associating visible unity primarily to a model of union called organic union, and organic union means transconfessional uniting churches, Faith and Order developed a vision of visible unity by describing the one church as, at the global level, as a conciliar fellowship of local churches which are themselves truly united. And this united has a lot to do with confessional identities. So the idea here would be that that conciliar fellowship would be the expression at the global level of churches that would have overcome their respective confessional, traditional identities. So you may imagine that this description was not very well received. It's the least we can say among the CWCs. And Faith and Order asked the CWCs to clarify their role. Which is the role you intend to play within this vision of unity? And the CWCs responded by formulating a notion, an understanding of unity as what we call reconciled diversity, in which visible unity includes non-divisive confessional identities instead of dropping them, as it was suggested by the Faith and Order language. Next. So there was a very lively debate, which could be the object of some PhD theses and so forth. And as a result of those discussions, a new attempt at greater coordination and complementarity between multilateral and bilateral dialogues took shape in the form of the establishment of the Forum on Bilateral Dialogues. It was established for 3 years, and its dynamic led it to have a much longer existence. And the Forum contributes to the reconciliation between the notions of mutual recognition of churches presented by the CWCs and the vision of unity of the WCC. Next, and I think I can finish in 1 or 2 minutes. So the Forum held 10 sessions so far, and you see the topics that were discussed during those sessions. Next. So here are some pictures of the brochures with the results, reports from those forums on bilateral dialogues. Next. So the other contribution to the complementarity between these two ways of working ecumenically is the collection of texts growth in agreement that you find, for instance, in the Faith and Order digital library. And here comes a last note. The debate continues in some ways, and I quote here a text, I make reference here to a text by Konrad Heiser, in which he notes that bilateral dialogues have taken very seriously the appeal to maintain the loyalty to one's own tradition, and that as a result, partners in ecumenical dialogue have been more hesitant to engage in a process of learning from one another and thus to allow a renewal of the respective traditions to take place. So the idea here is to raise the question, is the logic of bilateral dialogues and the psychology of bilateral dialogues conducive to a receptive ecumenism? So this is one of the questions in relation to this debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Reverend Odayo Mateus, for this overview. I think this will provide a very good foundation for our discussion. It was illuminating to hear it. Before I introduce our third and final speaker, I would like to remind you all to type your questions into the chat box on Zoom and also use the commentary function in YouTube. Thank you. And now our third and final speaker is Archbishop Professor Dr. Job of Tel Messos, permanent representative of the Ecumenical Patriarchate to the World Council of Churches. He has been appointed in 2019 rector of the Institute of Postgraduate Studies in Orthodox Theology in Chambéry, Switzerland, where he is professor of liturgical theology since 2010. Archbishop Job, the word is yours.
Thank you, Miriam. Well, I have several things that I would like to share with you today. And I would start by reminding and underlining that the Orthodox Church was a pioneer both in the ecumenical movement as well as in the bilateral dialogues. And that the bilateral dialogues were developed actually within the encounter of the other Christians in the ecumenical movement. This involvement of the Orthodox Church goes back to the beginning of the 20th century, not to the 60s, but the beginning of the 20th century with the encyclical of the Ecumenical Patriarch Joachim II, addressed to the primates of the heads of all the local Orthodox churches, asking them what should be our position, what should be our relation to the other Christian churches. So already this question was raised in 1902. And this encyclical was followed by another encyclical of the Ecumenical Patriarchate of 1920, calling all Christian churches in the world to constitute a fellowship of churches, which later became in 1948 the World Council of Churches. And since then, the Orthodox churches participated in all the meetings of the ecumenical movement, in the conferences of faith and order, and also the conferences of practical Christianity. And during these conferences, actually, they met the other Christians, and this is how the different dialogues began. Then we have in the 60s a second round. We have the Orthodox, the Pan-Orthodox conferences, in which all the Orthodox churches participated. These Pan-Orthodox conferences took place on the island of Rhodes in Greece in 1961, 63, and 64, and later the Fourth Pan-Orthodox Conference was gathered in Chambéry in Geneva in 1968. And then at these Pan-Orthodox conferences, there was the Pan-Orthodox decision to start to initiate bilateral dialogues. And this is how the bilateral dialogues began. And we have until now, since then until today, we have 6 official bilateral dialogues between the Orthodox Church and other churches on a universal level, on a world level. We have the dialogue between the Orthodox Church and the Anglican Communion since 1973. We have a dialogue with the Old Catholics, the Communion of Utrecht, since 1975. We have the dialogue with the Roman Catholic Church. The first plenary took place in 1980. We have the bilateral dialogue with the World Lutheran Federation since 1981. We have the bilateral dialogue with the Oriental churches, the pre-Chalcedonian churches, which exists since 1985. As a matter of fact, the birth or the initiation of this bilateral dialogue with the pre-Chalcedonian began through an encounter with these churches within the ecumenical movement, with different ecumenical conferences of the 1920s, and then during a meeting of the Commission on Faith and Order in 1964. So we see that the bilateral dialogues are linked with the encounters within the ecumenical movement, and they serve the ecumenical movement. And the sixth bilateral dialogue is with the World Reform Alliance since 1988. So as you see, we have 6 dialogues. These 6 bilateral dialogues continue their work until today. Some are more active, others are less active, but they exist. We can still ask for more, because we don't actually have on the world level bilateral dialogue with the evangelicals. We still don't have a bilateral dialogue with the Pentecostals. With the churches of the East, we don't have an official dialogue with the Assyrian Church of the East, the so-called, which was considered in the past as being the Nestorian Church. So there's more to do. But nevertheless, what has been done since, at least since the 70s until today, we can see that these bilateral dialogues, first of all, were the unanimous, was the result of a unanimous pan-Orthodox decision. It's not only some Orthodox that make a dialogue with other Christians. It's not only one particular local or national church that conducts a dialogue, but this is conducted on a pan-Orthodox level. And this pan-Orthodox decision, going back to the pan-Orthodox conferences of the 1960s, has served to reinforce the unity between the Orthodox. When we are confronted to dialogue with the other Christians, we must be on the same wave. We must come together to have some kind of unity and consensus between ourselves. So the dialogue, bilateral dialogues, has reinforced the Orthodox communion, as one can say. And these dialogues help to take into consideration that we have much more in common than what divides us. One of the purposes of the dialogue were always to underline, what do we have in common? Because following centuries of polemics, centuries of confrontation, centuries of divisions, it was very important to underline and to stress, what do we agree on? What do we have in common? What faith do we actually share? And it was actually a discovery to see that very often we have much more in common than what is actually dividing us. And thirdly, these dialogues, of course, help to overcome the misunderstanding of the past. And this is very important. And I think this is one of the positive results of these dialogues. I would just give 2 examples of very positive dialogues. the dialogue with the non-Chalcedonian churches, with the Oriental Orthodox churches, has been very helpful to see that these churches, which were through several centuries accused of being monophysites, are actually not monophysite. And the second agreed statement of Chambézy of 1990 clearly states that we share between the Eastern Orthodox and the Oriental Orthodox, we share the same faith, and that the misunderstandings of the past were linked to misunderstanding basically due to technical terms. A second very positive result is the result with the bilateral dialogue with the Roman Catholic Church, where we see that we agree on most things. And the recent documents, the recent years were concentrated on what is the most dividing issue over the questions of primacy and synodality. And the recent documents that have been agreed, the Ravenna document of 2007, the Chieti document of 2016, and now we are working, the Commission is working on another document also always on the topic of primacy and synodality in the second millennium and today. Basically, all these documents, all this work shows that we, both Orthodox and Roman Catholics, agree on primacy and synodality, but the major issue, the major problem is how this actually acts. So these dialogues are extremely important and have shown very good positive results. Of course, there is also what I could say could qualify as negative results. We had, for example, a very efficient dialogue, a very promising dialogue between the Orthodox Church and the Old Catholics between 1975 and 1987. And in those years, the dialogue was so constructive, so positive, that the unity, the unification of the Old Catholics and the Orthodox was imminent. We were thinking about reestablishing the communion between those two churches. And then arrived the issue of the ordination of women. The issue of ordination of women and also other ethical questions such as same-sex marriage has shown difficulties in the dialogue, especially with the dialogues with the Church of the Reformation. But nevertheless, the dialogue with the Anglican Communion, with the World Lutheran Federation, with the Old Catholics and with the churches, the Reformed churches, is still existing. And we do see that although these dialogues may not lead necessarily to the reestablishment of a full communion between the churches, these dialogues are extremely helpful, important to help us to understand each other and also to collaborate on issues where there are no division on our basic views and positions. It will stay there for the moment.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Archbishop Cho, for your reflections. It was very compelling for me to hear about what you shared about the dialogues of the Orthodox Church and the insights and learnings gained during these processes. Please let me offer my thanks again to all three speakers for their contributions. With a short time remaining, we will enter into a brief discussion. There's one discussion which is directed to all our speakers, so let us start with this question. It is about reception. There is the experience in many parts of the world that with these 50 years of very important bilateral dialogues and their outcomes, that they are received very poorly sometimes at the local level. At the same time, in other areas in this world, the people on the local level make the experience that sometimes in our local ecumenical context, we even go behind what has already been reached. So as this is a global webinar, when talking about reception, I would like to mention both these experiences on the local level that people have mentioned in the chat. Thank you very much for this question, and I would like to give it to our panel. Bishop Brian Farrell, would you like to go first?
All right, very briefly, just to say that reception, of course, is the fundamental challenge that we all have in this ecumenical quest. The problem is, from a practical point of view, that while it's possible for a group of people who gather together and rediscover the great common area of faith and life that we have, it's necessary, if this is going to be fruitful, that we carry with us the whole body of the church. Now, in a church like ours, you can very easily understand how it is then necessary for it to have a huge effort of education, a huge effort of communication, a huge effort of transforming ways of thinking, overcoming historical prejudices and so forth. It's a huge effort to bring the whole body of the church to an ecumenical understanding of where we are. So this is basically what we are involved in. We make every effort that we can. It will, of course, take time. We do what is necessary to promote this kind of reception in all the different parts of our church. But it's a huge task.
Thank you very much. May I pass the words to you, Odaya?
Well, we all recognize the problem, but we are always a bit perplexed in relation to the possible solutions. But I think that we should insist with our churches that ecumenical dialogue is an exchange of spiritual gifts. And we have to be humble enough in the spirit of the foot wash to be open to receive spiritual gifts from the churches with which we are in dialogue. But it's challenging. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Archbishop Job, can I invite you to offer your thoughts as well?
Of course, the major challenge is the challenge of reception. This is the greatest problem in the dialogues. First of all, I want to remind you, as Bishop Brian has said at the very beginning, that the members of these dialogues do not act as on their own, but they are sent as they are appointed by their churches, and therefore they report to their churches. I am a member of, and I'm co-chair of the International Joint Commission for the Roman Catholic Orthodox Dialogue. And each time when we have a meeting, for example, we, the delegates of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, always report to our synod. And so do all the members of the commission. Unfortunately, very often these reports, I speak very generally, so very often they are read at the Holy Synods of the local churches, and then very often the report ends there and there is no further implementation. This is one problem. And one of my professors, when I was a doctoral student, always underlined, he said that the our ecumenical work always starts at home, and we have to do our homeworks. And this means that we have to communicate with the people of our churches on all levels. And just to make a final comment, for example, we have marvelous documents, but very often these documents exist in a very limited number of languages. Very often they exist only in English, which is the lingua franca for the ecumenical movement nowadays. It's the koine of the 21st century. But how could you expect somebody in Georgia, in Romania, in Greece, in Bulgaria to read these documents if the person doesn't even know the English language? So we have to translate all these documents in several languages if we want them to be received by the world. I will stay there for the moment.
Thank you very much, Archbishop Job. As our time is already over, almost over, I would like to thank you all for this discussion, and I would like to encourage you to continue this ecumenical discussion. One way you could do this is to join the next webinar on the 24th of November, which will focus on the cross-fertilization between bilateral and multilateral dialogues, as well as on actual societal changes for the local and universal church. It will be moderated by Father James Puglisi from the Centro Borrognone. And before we conclude, let me offer my warmest thanks to our speakers and as well to all of you, the participants, for your attention and lively engagement. I hope that you will have the possibility to ask some of your questions during the next webinars. I'm sorry that we couldn't take them all. A brief word of thanks also to the WCC communication team. And speaking personally, may I congratulate the Faith and Order Secretariat on this new project of webinars and ecumenical dialogue, which I find very exciting. And now I invite you all to turn on your cameras and your microphones to greet each other.
Dair. Gracias, muito obrigado, Dair.
Wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks a lot, Octavian, Miriam,
Oh,
Marcelo,
very nice.
Walter, and the communications
Thank
team.
you all. After just seeing your names.
Blessings.
Please drop me a
Thank you.
line.
Thank you very much from Kiev, from Ukraine.
Thank
Thank
you.
you very much from
Thank
Steve
you very much. This is fantastic. So nice to see all of you.
Let's see each
Oh,
other at the
from
end of
Winnipeg.
November.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you
Come
for
and
a
see
great
you in November.
discussion.
Second time from
Thank you.
Studio.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Yeah, the
Hello,
next
ecumenical
webinar.
friends. Thank you.
See you then. And
See you in a month. Take care.
Bye.
Okay.
bye bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Everybody.
And goodbye to everybody.
Ciao.